Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today, I am debating Endless Aporia on whether egoists should be vegan. So, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Aporia.
Yeah, I'm Aporia, I guess, which would be my pseudonym. And I don't know, I have a single YouTube video where I responded to Cosmic Skeptics' veganism arguments, ethical veganism ones, and I don't know, it caused a little bit of controversy. And I thought I would come to another person who responded to Cosmic Skeptics' video in a different way, and I don't know, we'll have a discussion. I don't know if this is much of discussion or debate. I don't have any talking points that I bought. Like, I had the only prep was looking at your videos and seeing what kind of philosophy you hold and maybe challenging that a little bit. But yeah.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. I know that, obviously, Aporia, he has read some of the ancient Greeks, and as we know, the ancient Greeks fundamentally understood philosophy to be something that every man took part in. In the words of Iris Murdoch, philosophy is not was it good is not the esoteric object of philosophers, but the tool of every rational man. Something that I know that you'll probably disagree with, but definitely fundamentally important for this debate, and that we can
And
converse
I,
and
I think that
genuinely.
it very applies to me because I am not in philosophy. Like, I'm studying computer science, and but it's kind of fun and interesting, and I enjoy it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see where we'll go. Anyway, so the plan is to debate whether egoists should be vegan. I'm going to argue egoists should be vegan, even on a principle of egoism. Excuse me. Essentially, my argument would be that it is in the best interests of egoists to be vegan, not only because it is a plant-based lifestyle, and I could argue for the environmental and the well-being side of things. I don't plan to take a cheap shot and just say like, well, okay, don't get me wrong, it's true. Everyone should be plant-based for health, and we should care about our environment because otherwise we're going to end up in some deep trouble, even in relation to what is in personal self-interest. But that's not what I'm going to be arguing. I'm going to be arguing that you should act ethically in order to achieve happiness, the good life, anything that would essentially bring you any form of contentment and fulfillment.
Yeah, no, I sort of I agree that, like, I think that empathy for animals has a utility, and that we should take that into consideration. I also know that people like other people who are empathetic. Um, so I take the position that everybody tends to act in their self-interest. And sure, if you live in a privileged position in society where you have the means of becoming a vegan, I'm all for it. And I would want more people to be vegan, in a sense. I want veganism to be more accessible to people. I don't want the environmental impacts of veganism, or of meat eating, or animal agriculture. Uh, and there is some health. I think vegetarianism is more healthy than veganism, but also I'm not in. I don't know all of the talking points and all of the literature about health for veganism. I know you had a different debate about this a while ago, like a month ago.
I mean, with carnival.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, obviously, I went into that thinking it was an ethics debate, and it turned out to be a nutrition debate, and I didn't have any sources on hand. I mean, I could tell you stuff about like the Harvard nurses study and stuff like that, but like I can give you like some points of like reference, but I'm not going to basically
yeah.
hold
That's
you
the
like
thing.
you don't have empirical data here. I'm not going to be like, well, I've won because you don't have sources. That's ridiculous.
Me neither. Like, I didn't expect health or environmental argument in
As well,
this discussion.
philosophers.
Yeah, we're gonna philosophize, I guess. So it's pure philosophy, you know. Um, so yeah, that's my position. So I think we should make meat substitutes easier to come by. I think, but I also hold something that some would consider a maybe hypocritical position, or a self-contradicting position, in that I can simultaneously be for a global position, but against a very individual position. So if we find out that I will be better off if everybody stopped eating meat, which could be the case, while we still are eating meat, I'm fine with eating meat. So but I will still support globally banning meat if this was a thing.
Right.
Uh,
So you would, it's, the only thing I would even just on a baseline, I would say that would contradict like the disciplinary power in which you hold. So like you would be neglecting your own your own ability to bring around that change which would best suit you, and you'll be acting against your self-interest if you rationally accept that it was in your best interest.
I
So
consider this something like uh, tragedy of the common scenario for like overfishing, for example. If you had a society that lived on a lake where everybody was overfishing, and if you don't overfish, you will go hungry, your family will go hungry. You have to do this. It's in your rational self-interest to overfish. But somebody can overfish rationally while at the same time wanting everybody to come together and agree no overfishing.
the only time someone could do that is in a Hobbesian scenario in which they were enforcing, because they had a stronger will, they had a stronger an authoritarian position where they could enforce everyone didn't cause the damage that they were causing, so that they could reap the benefits without the consequences. Because otherwise, you would be left in a scenario where your actions were actually harming your overall interest. It wouldn't be rational anymore. And
Yeah, so you have the Kantian universalizability principle, right? In action, where if your
I
action is
don't even think you need that. I think you could even say that it's disciplinary. So you could say that by acting in accordance with my desire, not only am I fulfilling not only am I acting against my actual interests, I'm acting with my preferences and not my interests. And I would say that they're two separate things. But oh,
how would you distinguish interests and preferences?
so I would say that a preference was like an immediate desire, like an urge, perhaps a whim. So if you were to look at like Ayn Rand, I think she defines a whim as a desire in which the desirer does not know or care to know the cause. And an interest would be a desire which genuinely fulfills the the mandate of maximum subjective expression in the individual's interests, like in the
So
individual's
it's more long term,
towards the
essentially.
individual. Yeah,
More
it's
colloquially,
essentially like
long
the
term,
yeah
short term.
yeah. It's
Okay.
like essentially the whole life. It would be an understanding of your life narrative and
Mm.
your place within the world and how to achieve the maximum good experiences within that life.
Yeah, no, that distinction is fair. But I think if you take that second definition, this was interest, right? Which one was which? Uh,
Interest is just like essentially the broad understanding, and preferences is the like particular.
yeah. So in my contractarianist worldview, like this society of fishermen can collectivize, make a social contract together, and they will all be better off. But the individual game theory of it would mean that if this doesn't happen, everybody should overfish, and I would have no moral problem with that. I'll be like, this is, if you don't do this, your family's going to starve. But if you stop doing this, but everybody else continued, well, then they're going to overfish, and you're effed. And
I mean, the problem is that like I think this comes with an assumption of human nature in which you would assume human nature was bad. That would be a Hobbesian understanding that
I
people
don't.
will act in a self-interest in order to maximize their good over another individual's.
So yes, this is, for me. This doesn't assume bad or good. This assumes that people have sort of a very selfish worldview where first it's themselves, then maybe it's their family and friends, then maybe their community, and the circle of care increases the farther you go, which is I think a trend that you see with people's behavior, is that the more close it is to yourself, the more you tend to care about it, and the farther away, the less. Um, and there's an evolutionary reason for this, and that you have the selfish gene hypothesis, Richard Dawkins, where it's the evolutionary pressures are such that the more you share genetics with somebody, the more you care about.
You see, the thing is, I genuinely, I think even a Hobbesian approach, you wouldn't give a shit about your genes. Like, to put it in a
No, yeah, no,
um,
because if you do, like, if I acknowledge that this is why I may have those desires to care about my
right,
family,
right.
friends, then I can be like, well, is that really important? I can sort of suppress that, or say that this is irrational. This is my evolutionary uh, intuitions that
Mhm.
can't really be justified. But then the question becomes, okay, then what can be? Is it only yourself? Like, if you say that this is wrong, I can't replace it with anything. I just say this is what I have. I don't know if you could have those kind of like deep values and change
Well,
them.
well, I would say that the way that you never desire something like to desire. I would agree with Hobbes and say you cannot desire something which is not your desire. Like, it doesn't make any sense to say that I don't desire to do what I'm doing, because to do what you are doing, you must desire it because it is the desire that is urging your action. That's something I would agree with. However, I would say that those desires don't have to be entirely self-interested in the understanding of self that we have today. I wouldn't say that the self, for example, is absolutely individual. And I think that this individualism, which was really birthed around the time of Hobbes, the 17th century, I think it was, really comes around then. And I think that people used to understand themselves before this point in collectives. They wouldn't have even been able to understand what was in their own interests, primarily, like purely singularly. It would have been in the interests of families. This is how they understood their, like, for example, their duties and stuff like that. But this is more broadly, it was a problem. Don't get me wrong, and I don't agree with it because it limits the individual's cognitive abilities more than anything, to a very narrow scope in which they don't understand their actions as their own, and they take accountability for things that they could not have controlled, and it doesn't appreciate the volition of the individual. But the broader understanding of self is more accurate to what we are. I don't think our desires purely come from our biological foundation, and
You
instead
don't
are socio-political.
back. Oh, so you
Sorry?
think, okay, it's also the cultural. So we have
Yeah,
desires that
yeah,
come from culture. Yeah, I would agree with that. I also take the position that you can change people's values, like, but you have to do it by sort of appealing to a higher value. So you can say you shouldn't value your religion because it is not a good pathway to truth, and I suppose you value truth more. So if
exactly. I mean, this is essentially what Aristotle argues for. Um, if you read the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, like, okay, so you start off with any values you want, but then once you approach, not to interrupt, by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt.
it's totally
Um, you enter your institutions, for example, he would, like, say, like, medicine, warfare, whatever it is,
fine.
and you act on an individual level. So you'd be like, well, not individually, but you act on an individual level. You see those values in which you want to obtain in life, those goods that you want to achieve, and by trying to achieve those goods, you recognize that it might contradict those values that you currently have, or the goods that you seek. So if you were to, for example, like, I don't know, let's say you're a doctor, you'd find that being a doctor, to achieve the highest good in medicine, would mean that you had to wash your hands, for example. And so you'd have to remove the contradiction. Let's say if you did want to wash your hands, you'd have to remove that in order to maximize your ability to save patients, if that is what you wanted to do. So you'd say that you come to that point where, if okay, the good of medicine, this hypothetical good, is determined upon the good of uh, removing internal conflicts within that institution. Now, that institution is justified by another concept in your life. It's like medicine isn't like a self-justified thing. It would be something it's like, why do we have medicine in the first place? What is the sufficient reason for medicine? So then you take a step back and you go, okay, well, the sufficient reason for medicine is to obtain the better life because a better life is one in which I do not get sick, or if I do get sick, I can get treatment. And he's like, okay, so you do want medicine, but that means that um an individual who acts within an institution, their actions on a day-to-day basis constantly reflect their we'll call it axiomatic values. I think that's something like a lot of people would say. But just as much as they are acting and they are changing their behaviors to meet their values are changed by their actions. Because when we pull these institutions into question, we can reach an inherent contradiction in which, for example, the good of war might be to not exist. Because it would prevent, like, war is meant to obtain peace, to so that I do not have a bloody violent death,
Mhm.
and a defensive measure. However, by propagating warfare, I'm increasing the likelihood of my violent, bloody death. Therefore, I need to remove warfare, and then the good of war is to not exist. So you would say that that would overall change my values. So if I understood myself as like a warrior, I might understand that, okay, well, being a warrior is a terrible idea. This this is a really bad. I need to quickly just switch this out and become a doctor. And this is how we can pull ourselves into question. But that's because we're understanding ourselves in this narrative format. We're seeing ourselves as a being transmuted through time, in which I understand the good life. I understand that my actions aren't singular and reaching some sort of satisfaction in a moment, but rather that it's an overall pleasure pain sort of scenario. And I think that the beautiful thing about Aristotle is that you start with a subjectivist point, but then you gain an objective view by constantly rationally categorizing the world around you. And this leads to like categorical understandings.
The reason why I don't get an objective view is because I can always come up with, maybe these are extreme scenarios, maybe they're like state of nature scenarios. I was criticized like a few days ago, but I can create these scenarios, these game theory scenarios, where the rational self-interest of people uh, will cause overall harm, but I would not be upset. So for example, like you have three people in a boat. You have a young person, a middle-aged person, an old person. This is a famous thought experiment to debunk utilitarianism. Have you heard this one?
Hmm. I mean, I've heard. See, I've heard this one, but usually to bunk rational egoism. Well, egoism.
Well, let's find out. Because I heard this one as a debunk of utilitarianism. But you have three people in a boat and you have different ages. An objective moral philosophy would say there's an answer. Oh, sorry. I should continue. If nobody kills any one of them, they all die from starvation. One of them needs to die in order to save the other two. That's sort of the idea. And then you have this dilemma where you have these three people in a boat, and if nothing happens, everybody dies. If one person gets killed, the other two survive. So the question is, who gets killed? And if you're a utilitarianist, you might say the old person. But it doesn't really matter what you say. If you have an objective philosophy, something that's objective, you will always have an answer for this. It might be problematic, it might be something, but you have an answer. Well, when I saw this thought experiment, I was like, this is a problem for objective morality, because even if the correct moral answer was the old person gets killed and eaten, I don't think the old person should accept this. Like if I was the old person, I would do everything in my power to fight back or something.
Well,
So
I think that's a good criticism of something like a Kantian position. So a Kantian position is divorced our desires in the first place from our motivations, like duty for duty's sake, for example. This idea of being motivated purely by something exterior, reason itself.
mhm.
Um, no. That doesn't happen. You actually, I mean, you're creating your duties from ex nihilo. Then, I mean, that's literally like, um, it it's not only libertarian free will, which I'm not convinced by, but it just doesn't make any sense because I think not Hobbes, Hegel even points this out. He says, okay, so let's imagine that we have a duty to show respect for an individual. Well, how do we show respect? Well, that's a cultural phenomena. These are concepts which pre-exist, or understandings of them, and that's what we are developing, or understanding. We when we act ethically, we're developing our understanding of how to interact with each other to obtain the maximum subjectivity. But the point is that it's to maximize um what is morality in the first place. And I think what Kant kind of does is he presupposes like a Judeo-Christian foundation which understands goodness in a way that relates to God, and duty itself, and he's kind of divorced.
Doesn't
And
he have categorical imperatives and
oh yeah, it's the categorical imperative, but it's the fact that hmm,
is a categorical imperative Judeo-Christian? I thought it was.
no, it's not. I mean, actually, he famously, I'm not saying that he is like doing this because of. I mean, his philosophy is very separate to Judeo-Christianity.
Mhm.
He famously used to turn left. Like everyone would walk. I'll explain that. So everyone on a Sunday would come out to go to mass, like after they finish university, and they'd all turn right, and he deliberately walk left, because he was anti-authoritarian. Like he was like the only thing that you should be subject to is your own reason. Um, so it's definitely not Judeo-Christian in that respect. Um, but I think when I say Judeo-Christian, I mean that I'm talking about his neo-Lutheran foundations. For example, he believes that when he entered his philosophy, for example, that it was wrong to lie in all cases. The reason that he would have thought that in the first place is because what neo-Lutherans thought in the first place. Now, that's not like a criticism of his position. I'm not going to ad hominem the bloke. I'm not like, oh, he's wrong because he was brought up a neo-Lutheran. But it explains why he wanted to defend such a position in the first place. It seems that he had divorced. What I'm arguing is that he's divorced morality from itself. So morality in Kant seems to be very differently defined at what it had been in the past. Because if we look at what morality had come from, I mean, it's probably a bloody meme of think saying this now. Morality comes from the Greek ethikos, which is to decide the behaviors in which we will live our lives, and these
Mhm.
relate to the good of our lives, and that goodness isn't created by us, but rather exists within our everyday experiences. These are the positive and negative phenomenological experiences of our lives. So when we enter a scenario and we achieve pleasure, then that is inherently a good, and pain is inherently a bad. I mean, obviously, pain and pleasure sometimes get conflated in weird ways where people go, well, BDSM, like how would you explain that? And I would explain that as it's a word game. The
Mhm.
people are still pleasuring themselves.
Yeah.
They're still having a positive experience. They're not having a negative one
Mhm.
overall. That's why they're seeking it. I mean, Aristotle even points this out. He's like, people start to seek bitter things when they have excesses. It's not that they're seeking pain, it's that they want pleasure of eating something bitter. Um, so yeah, I hope that clears that up. But the point is that you cannot help but seek this goodness which is inherent to desiring. And I think Kant saw desire as something that is totally libertarian, and that you could have a reason that it almost wills itself. And weirdly enough, it does the same problem as Nietzsche, where it's the will that wills its own will. And I think it's quite ironic that he goes down the same route, but it doesn't make any sense because it rejects the foundations of reason in the first place. That's Hegelian argument. Like you're telling us I should universalize something, but then how do I universalize something that is not like what would be the perfect universalization of a concept that is socioculturally embedded? Well, I don't know because I have to apply that concept and develop it over time. It's not something that's just given to us. So it's it's almost like what Kant wants is not not capable of yet, at least in a Hegelian sense. It's something that would require perfect knowledge in if Hegel read Kant right. So that would be my argument against Kant. Like he's just divorcing ourselves from what action urging like desires in the first place, like what desires. It's not that he's wrong, because Kant did argue that the rational end of all beings is happiness. It's just that he's skipping a few steps and he's thinking that we can conceptually jump straight to the end goal, even though we don't know what it is. And that's the real problem with Kant. Because if we did know what it is, what we would find in theory is that it should be our desire because it will maximize the greatest good that we could possibly achieve. But by divorcing ourselves from it, we've alienated ourselves from the good in the first place. And that's his mistake. Um, I can't remember now why I had to explain Kant.
Well, I brought up the boat thought experiment. Do you have a different take on it? I'm
Well,
just curious.
I think that so the point is that like Kant, like a Kantian understanding would see the boat as the guy should sacrifice himself. Like, like it's his moral duty.
Mhm.
But or I mean, you could take a Kantian approach and say that he if you were to be really like if you were to be nice to Kant, I suppose you could say that ought implies can, and he's incapable of desiring his own self-destruction. Um, I don't think Kant would necessarily. I did say that actually. He did say suicide was irrational. Um, so maybe, but I guess the point is that the individual wouldn't necessarily have.
Say that they're immoral for wanting to eat him, but then again, anybody.
No, I don't. I don't know actually. I don't know how.
He has this people own, like he has the ideas of property, of your own body is something that only you can own. You have the right to your own body. So I guess in that case, the other like everybody would be immoral for wanting to kill the other person. I guess in this scenario, I have a suspicion that he might think that everybody should just die.
What Kant to think everyone should just die?
Yeah, because he has the people have a right to their body. This is a big thing in his. Um,
Why would that necessarily lead to death?
Maybe I'm not sure. I wish we
Well, if
had.
anything, because I can't like not to diverge too far from the topic, because Kant believed in immortality, and he said that the categorical imperative is so strong that we require like an eternal life to fulfill it. Uh,
I did not know that he believed in immortality. Wait, like which?
like life after death, like life after death. His
Oh,
argument was arguing for life after death, that we had to keep trying to achieve the categorical imperative because it was so binding.
okay.
Um, yeah, well, that's him. That's his decision. But anyway, um, at the same time, I guess my point would be it's not that. I guess I would just invoke what implies can for the most part, that someone could not desire that which is undesirable, and their own destruction would essentially be undesirable by definition. Um, um, but I wouldn't have to, because I would say that people do kill themselves um, for the greater good. People do jump on grenades. People do, save children because they hold values that aren't individual. And this is
Hmm.
my point that I was making in the first place, that individuals.
I agree with this. I think people do hold values aren't individual because as good as because I think there's evolutionary pressures to do that.
You see,
Um,
the point is whether these values are a good thing or a bad thing. Now, I would say that these values
how
are
you
a good
determine
thing
the value?
inherently. It would be how well it achieves your interests.
Okay, but your interest is based off of another value. So if you have an interest in your own happiness, well, you value yourself, or like you can it's
It,
turtles all the way down in a sense. So
yeah,
you
well, this is the point I think that Aristotle was getting at.
yeah.
Like, it's not that the good and bad don't pre-exist any understanding that you are going to invoke, but rather that no matter what your starting position is, it will be called into question. It's like in Plato's Gorgias, Callises, he's talking and he's really like a Platonic Nietzsche. And he's arguing that we should maximize, we should let our desires wax and wane to the point in which we have the strength to fulfill them. It says like, what evil is temperance to the powerful man, to the son of a king, and all this. And he basically says that we, what we should do is let our desires build and build and build, and then fulfill them, because that will bring the greatest level of contentment. And then Plato goes, okay, well, Socrates goes, right, but can we agree that to desire is to suffer? And by that he means like, so then he goes like, is it true that being hungry is painful? He's like, yes. He's like, and thirsty, yes. And he's like, can we agree that all desires are painful? He's like, to want something but not have it is to be in a state of um dissatisfaction. And he's like, yeah, I can agree on that. And he goes, okay. And the fulfillment of these desires is pleasure. So to eat is pleasure, to drink is pleasure. And he goes, yes, okay. And he says, but if pleasure was the end of this, then we should genuinely let our desires build up and then fulfill them to the maximum degree, because that will give us the greatest amount of pleasure. But but in Gregorius, he's like, well, this wouldn't make so much sense. He says, and he gives the example of two men. He says, who would you rather be? He says that there's two soldiers. One is a coward and one is a brave man. And he says the coward will have the greatest desire to kill the foe, like to kill his enemy, and he will achieve the greatest happiness once he has killed his enemy. However, the brave man will not have the same desire to kill his enemy. He'll have a desire, but not as immediate, not as pressing, and he won't gain the same satisfaction. So he'll have a lower amount of pleasure, but he'll also have a lower amount of pain. So what he's saying is it's about a pleasure pain ratio in regards to how you live your life. So you might think you want this pleasure of fulfilling, this desire, but in fact, by fulfilling it, you end up in the scenario where you are never content. And he compares it to a bucket with holes in the bottom versus a one that can be filled. You will constantly like drain all of the goodness out of your life, because you will be in a constant state of pain from desiring so much. And I think this applies to a Hobbesian account, because Hobbes understood individuals to desire in relation to felicity. Felicity is for those
Happy.
of you who don't know Hobbes, is the it's not that you just desire something and that you wish to obtain it. Like you don't just desire an object, but rather you desire to maintain your possession of these goods in your life, of this objects, of these experiences. So you need more power. So you desire power constantly, and you will constantly desire more and more power. And he says that that is inherent to human nature, that we will desire more and more power. Now, you see, my point is that it's not necessarily um, inherent to human nature, because if we understand that the good in our life is in relation to a restriction into self-discipline, then we can live a life which is more content. We try to balance out this pleasure pain relationship to achieve the maximum uh, good for our interests. This would
Yeah,
be my position in an egoist sense. But I would also take that the ego is not a creation of an individual. I would say that it does not come from the biological form that you are, but is a linguistic construction. That, like, for example, it would be ridiculous to say that me, Lewis, 21st century man over here, could go and be transposed back into ancient Greece, because my entire psychology, my psyche would be inherently different. My way of thinking, my way of living, my even the desires that I inherently hold, those values that I have and that I can obtain would be different, because my understandings are different, because my concepts have been developed over time. And I would say that these desires, these concepts, these second order desires, as we'll call them, are given through language, and that by maximizing them, we achieve our greatest happiness. But not only that, we internalize them to such a high degree that we can understand that if we really do understand them to be our values, that they can be transposed against our life. Like it is possible that I could live in that, for example, as an old man in a boat with two other people, two young children, and I sacrificed them to save myself, that the existential guilt of letting them die for my benefit would ultimately mean that death would have been the better option.
Yeah, like I think that in that case, I could definitely see an old man sacrificing themselves for the two children, um, and uh, you can look at it in an evolutionary lens where it's like, okay, you're not likely to reproduce, so you sort of lose your ego, you lose your value for yourself at that age, um, and you are more willing to sacrifice yourself, which I think is probably true, right? Older people are more likely, like the Japanese elderly who went into the nuclear plant to clean it up after the Fukushima. Um, so that's
I don't
definitely,
think it's necessarily just old people though, because you do get young people who do it.
yeah. Uh, so I'm fine with people being altruistic in this way. So I'm a like I'm not a I don't I'm not an ethical egoist. I'm a descriptive egoist. So I do see that people do tend to act in their self interest, um, but you don't have to. And if you find greater value in other people's happiness, then that's fine. I just have difficulty telling somebody who does, like, I don't know how you can convince somebody to act against their own self-interest, because I don't think anybody can convince me to
I
act
don't
against
think
self-interest.
I don't think you have to convince someone to act against their own interests. What you have to convince them is that their own interests are they're already acting against their own interests when they're being selfish. It's like what Ayn Rand says, "With the desires of rational men do not contradict each other." The point is that
You tell somebody they're acting against their own self-interest, um, you appeal to greater value for them, right? You have
yeah,
to one of their values that they hold greater.
mhm.
Um, but if somebody's greatest value is their own self-interest, uh, then you have a problem. Or
You would appeal to the sufficient reason in which the value is placed on, and that will always be the good life.
okay, so if the good life would be somebody's greatest value, so you appeal to that, or
Well,
um,
I would say the good life is something in which it holds somewhat ambiguity because we're always, I think Alistair McIntyre describes it like a quest. We begin with like an understanding, a narrative in which we seek, like I remember before I became a philosopher, quick anecdote, um, I wanted to be a scientist, right? Like when I was young, I wanted to be, at first I wanted to be like a volcanologist, really interested in geography, but still love geography, it's great. And then I wanted to be a physicist. Now, Sharp realized that I wasn't suited for physics. Not necessarily not suited, but as much as I wasn't not interested enough to put the work in for physics as I would have to be. I wasn't. I like the concepts behind it. I like the celestial bodies. I loved the whole black hole stuff. I loved everything like that. It was amazing. But the maths, I was not interested. I was like, oh my God, this is unbearable. And I appreciate it. I think it's amazing. Like, I mean, even doing something like I remember reading a paper once when I was doing my A levels, and it had like this equation, and I was looking at this equation. I was like, all right, okay. And then the question below it was just calculate the mass of the sun, and I was just looking at it like, what are you asking of me here? Like, um, and I had not done enough work to enter that essay and then calculate like exam and then calculate the mass of the sun because I hadn't been interested enough. I didn't have the vocation within me. It wasn't sparking any joy within us to do physics.
mhm.
And so I pulled into question why I wanted to be a physicist. It's like, well, I want to be a physicist because, well, that's what I thought would be a good life for me. But it seems that my understanding of the good life was flawed. And so I decided to go into something else. Now, what did I enjoy? I enjoyed philosophy. and I
Because
enjoy
you
geography.
like you weren't getting fulfilled by going into physics. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
so that okay.
And not only that, like it seems that what we can understand is that it pulls into question like the whole narrative of our lives. Like I started not seeing myself as a physicist. I was like, well, like, and my whole life narrative changed. And not only that, like I think you start understanding like what there's a vague ambiguity of what this good life will then look like. Like, what am I moving towards here? And you start to realize, well, it's that those moments of happiness on an individual on a day-to-day basis, on a minute-to-minute basis, on a second-by-second basis, and maximizing them to the greatest degree. And I think that's why, even like, it's almost like Buddhism. It seems to be somewhat, weirdly enough, kind of appealing to an egoistical value because it's like life is suffering. You want to minimize your suffering, so you pretty much want to destroy your ego. I mean, don't get me wrong, they don't really destroy their egos because they try and maximize um, altruistic joy and altruistic desires. And this is where I think the wisdom of Buddhism really lies. They're like they see that selfish desires actually end up causing them more pain than bringing them pleasure. And that's the argument that I'm making.
See,
That
is
this
like
selfish fulfillment is actually going to cause you greater suffering than it will happiness.
so I agree with this if you use the sort of colloquial definition of selfishness where it's very individualistic. But when I use selfishness, I usually take into account other people. So I like if I explain people my philosophy, people are like, "You're an asshole." Like your entire philosophy is based on selfishness. But if I didn't, they would see me as just a regular person who is you will do favors, is very nice, uh, because that does bring me happiness. I'm kind to people, and the how I explain it is I say I want to be around nice people. I want to be and the only way I can be around nice people is if I'm nice. Like they wouldn't want me around them otherwise.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that how society is so influential, how it affects me in so many ways, and I have empathy, descriptively, and I enjoy seeing people I like be happy.
Yeah.
Um, so I act like everybody else. I just acknowledge that my being nice to people is selfish. Like I am, if it didn't make me happy to be nice to people, I wouldn't do it. If it made me suffer to be kind to people, I wouldn't do it. And that's in the colloquial sense of selfishness. I totally agree with you that if you are just a dick to everybody, then you're gonna have you know,
A
you're not gonna
miserable kind of
have
existence.
a full existence. Um, so that's the sort of selfishness that I refer to when I make.
I can see why you do that. I think there's some wisdom there, to be honest, because I think that we do use selfishness in perhaps the wrong way. Like, for example, in The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand, it seems that she's arguing like for selfishness. But she's not, because she says that you should limit your desires. Like you shouldn't necessarily do that which is going to cause you suffering, and it ultimately pulls back on this like happiness for you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, especially since I see happiness as almost like a cultural endeavor. But I guess the point I would be making is that I don't think happiness is an individual achievement. Happiness is institutional. I would say that how we achieve those understandings or how we achieve it are institutional. And
For me, for all intents and purposes, happiness is in my brain. And happiness for everybody is not connected. So every single person experiences happiness their own way. And if there was some sort of sociopath in that enjoyed seeing other people suffer, and that made them happy, I wouldn't call that person like immoral. I would just say their way of becoming happy is against my way of becoming happy. Like it contradicts my way, and I would want to pressure them to or put them in prison or like do something, change their motivation such that they are not a problem for me. I will never So other people having a different, uh, like if somebody doesn't have happiness from being nice to other people, I will not interact with them. I will avoid them. I won't call them immoral. I will say their way of uh, getting happiness is against my self-interest, or against my way of getting happiness, and it's a conflict. It's a conflict with no like grand global resolution.
You see, I would say that happiness is individual in the sense that, like, as you say, it's like states of your brain. Like, I don't think we can deny that, like, uh, that that it happens to an individual. I'm not going to say that it's just dopamine and serotonin, because I do think these things are a big, factor in it. But it's how, it's also in relation to your whole life, because I mean, you talk about how some people get like dopamine resistance, and so the highest levels of dopamine don't
Yeah.
necessarily make it. So
Happiness is sort of how or dopamine and hormones and everything like that is how the brain gets you to act in a way that will make you survive and reproduce. It's like uh, all of the stuff that makes you happy tends to be the things that will pass off your genes. Um,
well, ish. Because it seems that people like you get like the pathology of our species is such that where happiness, where psychology is developed in such a way that we will have sex, for example. We will, like, our happiness will sometimes be to gain, like, have vasectomies, use contraception, and stuff like that. So we act in ways that we seek the pleasure
Evolution
mechanism.
takes shortcuts, right? Like it's like, okay, yeah, just sex is good enough, right? Because that's all you need. Evolutionary speaking, all you need to care about is the sex. You don't really need to care about the consequences of the sex. So the pressures were such that the sex itself, the act, is more important than the consequences of the pregnancy.
But
So
this is the thing. But then we understand that the pregnancy and the consequences form a relation to how we live our lives. And what we understand is that we don't want necessarily like a million kids,
we want
even
the
even on
sex.
an environmental scale. Like,
Yeah.
and
So evolution goes about like in the sense of good enough. Like it's good enough to like these uh things that make you happy or will it's good enough to make you reproduce. We don't need to go deep with that idea. Um but
just
that's
to just to sorry,
yeah, go for it.
just to clarify something, I think like a really good point was brought up in the Peterson Zizek debate,
I
because
saw.
did you
Yeah.
see it? It's great. I really enjoyed that. I'm doing a review on that because I really love that. Well, Zizek brought up this point where he was like, I agree, and he's like, that biology is important. He's like, I'm not someone that's going to reject the importance of biology, but look at sexuality, and he was like, we'll prolong it, we'll do all these different things. These aren't natural behaviors in the sense of like natural behaviors. These are cultural phenomena. These are artificial, and we internalize them. And I don't think we realize how much we actually internalize. And this is his point about implicit ideology. Now, sometimes that ideology is bad. He says that only something like religion could make a good person do bad things. But then it's only something like religion that could make a bad person do good things as well. That the individual could internalize something which is in their own interests. And this is what I would argue happens within institutions. The psychopath who seeks his interest by killing people, um, he's not necessarily he's appreciating the urge that he has within himself, but not necessarily the understanding of what the good life is. And the only way that he can understand the good life is to understand the good life of man, like of humans, because he can't make
Why him?
um
I
because
thought,
because like without, or at least people in his culture, and you know what I mean, like individuals who are somewhat similar to himself, he has to understand himself in relation to others.
or community, like why, like even for you, why not just all animals? Like what,
Oh,
how
but
do you
I mean that's fine. I mean, he has to understand himself in relation to the to the expression of subjectivity, I would say, like how we could maximize this expression of subjectivity to achieve happiness. So you'd say, like, for example, like, I mean, even me and you, right? I'm assuming neither of us have had something like, with neither of us might have been in a car crash. I don't know if you've been in a car crash. I've never been
Uh,
in a car crash. But I know I don't want to get in one, right? And and that's because other people who have been in car crashes have taught me that car crashes aren't good things, right? And it's this association that I make with them as other individuals, basis of species or culture, whatever. I realize that car crashes are actually really just not desirable, and so I avoid them. And that's a rational thing to do because I understand that I am like them in X ways. These epistemic relations force me to understand that actually, because I am like other individuals in A, B, and C, then I should avoid X, Y, and Z, or seek whatever. And this is the point I'd get at. Like this conceptualization, it's not individual. And the psychopath who seeks the life of, you know, murdering individuals, not only would they'd be incapable of knowing whether it would actually achieve happiness for them, because they would either be so dissimilar to other individuals that it would not achieve them happy, make them achieve happiness. They would realize as I mean, there is the selfishness of it in the sense that they would go to prison and this, that, the other, power locked. But also I think in whether achieving selfish desires as it is, like, in this like self-orientated desires would bring them fulfillment because they would kill one. It's like the another anecdote almost is at the execution of Louis the 15th, I think it was 15th, I think, yeah. His defense lawyer argued, he said, like, okay, Louis, he's a bastard, right? He's an absolute dick. He betrayed France, but killing him would be wrong because if we kill one person for happiness, then why won't we kill two, three, four, and
well,
it'll progress?
I have a problem with that argument. First of all, we do kill people. Like, not necessarily it's effective, but we do this all the time. We decide that people are not worth it for society.
Well, I mean, what his point is that killing someone for happiness won't achieve happiness. Now, my point would be is doing anything selfishly won't achieve happiness. If you do anything on an individual level to achieve like a sense of immediate gratification, it's not going to bring that about. But delayed gratification, well, that is a institutionally embedded concept, in which is relation to the good life of individuals. We understand the good life in relation to how individuals can achieve happiness as how we understand individuals. And I think, I mean, I don't think these institutions would be possible if we were all killing each other. So that would bring that into question. Like the state of war would destroy the rationality of our states, which would prevent the psychopath from actually being able to work out how to achieve the good life. And so he'd be contradicting his own decision-making process. But also that the concepts within them and how he understands himself or should understand himself is that to desire these things is wrong because it will not bring him happiness and it will bring him ultimately not only to prison but a discontentment. I mean, have you ever heard of a murderer who's like, you know what, actually, if I hadn't have killed those people, I'd be. I mean, they might actually say it because they're psychopaths, but the if I hadn't have killed those people, I would never end up, I would never have been happy or this, that, the other. I don't think it is because it's a pathology, right? It's like it's like a jealous individual or an anti-Semite or like in the Zizek debate, like it's something that they're doing to fulfill their psychology and exert their identity, but their identity is being exerted in a way in which does not actually bring them fulfillment, and they're constantly having to seek more and more and more and a greater and greater expression.
So in that
Um,
sense, the fulfilling of the desires would be something that you would maybe initially suspect wouldn't satisfy your fulfillment, but in the long term, more global sense, it does, and so you're acting wrong in a more long-term sense.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It's not that
okay.
the psychopath might gain like enjoyment. I have no doubt about that. That some people can get sadistic kicks out of killing people.
Hmm.
But whether it would be in their interest, well, that's a rational concept which is within an institution, and I don't think that our concepts would align. I would argue our concepts do not align with murdering people. We would say that would
Hmm.
bring you unhappiness.
So if there was some sort of thought experiment entity, not necessarily a human, that does have its interest in the suffering of people, uh, do you? And if it was part of this human, like, so would it change your mind if that entity was part of humanity, part of the human culture, or if it was external to it? Um,
I mean, if its nature was so different that it couldn't enter a language game because we would not understand the words it would invoke, like the concepts within its mind, well, then our morality couldn't apply to it. I think Hegel makes this point even about other cultures. He's like, you can go and tell other cultures that they're wrong for doing X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't make a difference because there's only two ways you could do it. You could say you can enforce your authority upon them, tell them that they are wrong, but then they haven't actually made any moral progress in the way that they're thinking. They haven't had any conceptual growth. You're just enforcing your authority on them. Or you could go and speak to them, and you could either, if you could try and rationally build up their concepts to meet yours, or they could do the same to you. Um, or if you were speaking something so foreign, it would just they wouldn't understand it. They'd be
yeah,
incapable of
so
understanding.
that's another, like, it's another problem I see with objective morality, in that if we look at morality, it isn't objective, in that there's different cultures and each they have separate ideas of what is objectively moral. And my problem is, how, given two objective moral systems, how do you determine which one is the correct one? Is there a mechanism behind this? Um,
Well, Hegel argues it's subjectivity. That's essentially all it can be, is the greatest expression of self-interest, and that the greatest amount of self-interest by individuals expressed amongst all of society would be the best system. So the one with the least contradictions.
So, okay, so you compare these two societies, one has greater self-interest per capita than another, and that would be sort of defining which system is better.
Well, it's essentially if more individuals are living good lives in which they are more satisfied and content because
But
they're
isn't now it just a utilitarian system, because this
well,
greatest self-interest would be just sort of utilitarist, which would be an objective system.
somewhat utilitarian because the beautiful thing about Hegel is he doesn't fall into this notion of, all right, well, what we should do is maximize utility. He says that what we need to do is understand our duties and how we would maximize this amount of subjectivity. And the way we do that is through institutions and seeing the conflictions in our lives which need resolved. I think he pulls out this idea of like a woman who knows it is wrong to steal but must feed her child. And he's like, she's torn between two institutional understandings of the good life, essentially. She has the moral duty to not steal, and she has the duty to steal to save the child's life simultaneously. And that this conflict is ultimately what needs resolved. So that, for example, we would resolve this with welfare, for example, or we would resolve this with not penalizing someone who stole to save the child's life, or whatever way that we could, so that this inherent confliction within the individual never occurred in the first place. That their understanding flowed through, and that they would understand the good life in a way that they could reach this scenario and not have this problem uh, in the first place. It wouldn't be a problem. It would be just another obstacle to overcome, the same ways that they would face anything else in their life. Um, so in that sense, like the systems with the least contradictions for the given individuals would be the best system. And
So
this is
the
the
least
abstract right.
contradictions, meaning what would be a contradiction? Somebody who, how do you characterize
I would say
contradiction in
that
this sense?
the contradiction would be the minimization of the likelihood of acting against one's interests so that you're not going to, for example, let your child starve because you think it is the good thing to do. That
Mhm.
this understanding of what the good thing is has been resolved epistemically, that we've grown our concepts to resolve these issues.
Okay. So so two societies. One, you would look into see which one has the least contradictions, which is like people acting against their self-interest in a sense, um, to determine which one is a better society.
Yeah, well, the way you would determine the better society would be like, for example, he gives the example of a slavery. Um, he says that like it's inherently better because not only is the society without slaves, sorry, is inherently better because not only are the slaves um free then and achieving their happiness and their good, um but also their inclusion within our institutions betters our institutions, which betters our understanding, which allows me to live the happy life and the good life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like slavery is often an example when I tell people that I'm a moral anti-realist or a moral subjectivist. First thing is slavery, then I think I get like child abuse. I don't know, and then it goes down a list of things I have to justify now, right? Because if you don't believe in objective morality, then suddenly like people start throwing every single horrible thing for you to explain why it's bad. And then for slavery, I would say, first of all, for in the global sense, like slavery is bad for the society, um, economically at least, even just at the economic level. Slavery was good in the Americas until the Industrial Revolution, where slavery no longer became economically viable. And then that, along with the civil rights movement to change cultural views, sort of made slavery go away. And then the people who, and then slavery existed for like thousands of years before that. Um, so there's this very quick desire to say slavery is like bad, but it would be the equivalent of going to one of these like early Romans and saying you are bad for having slaves when every empire, every culture there had slaves. It would be just the norm.
The
Um,
beautiful thing about Hegel in this regard is that not just Hegel, actually, do you know anything about Foucault?
mhm.
Um, Foucault argued that ancient Christians could not have known slavery was wrong. They just couldn't have. This is the concepts weren't developed enough. That's where Hegel stands. He would say that like, yeah, it's true. A society without slavery is better. They couldn't have known that. There's absolutely no way that they could have known that a society without slavery would be
But
better.
would it have been better at the time?
Well, he would say that like just in general, like um, for example, let's say you have uh
So slavery was going down in the Americas until the invention of the cotton gin, which suddenly made slave labor super valuable for the plantation owners. And then for the plantation owners, it created a huge demand for slaves. And then once other methods besides that were invented during the Industrial Revolution, slave labor no longer became economically viable. And then it went down. Plus the civil rights movement, the Civil War. Um, so it seemed as though as the utility for slaves increased, people did have slaves. But it's also a power thing because maybe the global utility was horrible, right? Because the slaves didn't have the power. But if so, the overall utility, including the slaves in the system, was negative. But and you can even there's some arguments you can make that it was also bad for the plantation owners in that they wouldn't have gained the economic value of the slaves um, that could have been working and inventing things and contributing to society. But you can see that in history we love to have this moral high ground in our current moral systems, where we say slavery is obviously bad, murder is bad, rape is bad. We have these like things that we deem bad, but if you, and then we like wag our fingers at history, saying, "Look how horrible these people were, and look how great everything changed." But if you lived in that society, if you went into the past, you would have probably behaved like everybody else.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I make this argument about veganism every day, right? Like, like look at it like this, right? Like the average everyday individual, right? Most of them do not want to give up cheese, and we can argue that it's addictive with queso morphine, blah 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 blah, right? Right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to give up cheese, they don't want to give up meat, they don't want to change their lifestyle, right? Now, these people are telling me, right? Now, when we're talking about this, we're talking about, the deaths of billions of sentient creatures every year who are feeling pain and suffering to a degree which is astronomically high. I mean, if we're talking in a utilitarian sense, the negative utility is astronomical, right? Um, that being said, right, these people don't want to give up these animal products. But these people are telling me that if they had a slave which did all of that work for them, right, like all of the housework that they could just use, that would essentially bring such an advantage to life, they would be telling me that they're more willing to give up a slave. Like if they had the same conceptual understanding of slaves as the people around then did, which is not ours, very
Mm-hmm.
clearly, because they haven't been brought up in a society which abolished slavery 200 years ago. So they understand slaves to be part of the everyday normal experience, natural, necessary, and normal. Then they would remove slaves because of the kindness of their hearts. What a lord. Like
Yeah.
these people would have done exactly the same as everyone else because they already are. They're fulfilling the same moral mandates as these other people. They're not achieving what we would see as the upper echelons of what I would say is rational consideration of how to live a good life. They're just fulfilling their desires, their immediate desires, their preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what most people do. They innately just gravitate towards their preferences. Now, what they
Yeah.
don't realize is that that's not a good thing for them. And I think, if anything, I think contemporary society is evidence of that. We live now in a time where people are highly medicated, um, in a consumerist, hedonistic society, which tries to seek self-fulfillment at every way and turn. People buying like different products, which most are inherently harmful for us, like food and stuff like that. So we'll have rampant obesity. We'll have an epidemic of health issues related to smoke and drinking and other hedonistic outlets. And all of these things ultimately cause us more suffering than bring us happiness, but we're incapable. Well, we're not incapable of seeing it. We choose not to see it, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we're blinded by what institutions of our
Yeah.
society, and we're
There's
taught not to see
I
it.
have a friend who is also eats meat, but we had a debate about veganism because the way he justifies eating meat is something more akin to what Alex or from Cosmic Skeptic debunked, where it's like based off of conscious. I think his was consciousness, but you can also have suffering. And for me, I take the position that I um, that you can make any sort of distinction like this. I think it's all arbitrary, and then I can fully acknowledge suffering and consciousness, and then do it anyway. So like if you were so a lot of meat eaters would say uh, animals don't suffer, and that's why it's okay to eat them. And I take the kind of weird position of, yeah, no, animals suffer, and some of them might even suffer more, but I do it anyway because I gain more pleasure from eating them than I do from uh, from any like empathy I have for them. Is
See,
essentially.
my point would be, and this is where me and Cosmic Skeptic disagree. I would say, regardless of your empathy, you're wrong, and you only think you're achieving more happiness. Well, the epistemic foundations for what will be the good life and how to achieve it will ultimately lead to, for example, to the concept of equality, which is necessary for the basis of society. And the concept of equality, the epistemic foundations for that will apply to animals as well.
But for me, equality is based off of it's sort of part of the social contract, in that like I can make a social contract with any human and I can't with any animal. My utility for humans is my implicit empathy. what they do for me economically, what do they contribute to society. That's my value for a human. My
Yeah, but
value for an animal is food. They can be cute and some empathy. Um, for me, I don't have any value in a human's. I don't get any value from eating a human, from killing a human. I have no desire to hurt humans. I only have desires not to. And for animals, I have some desires not to, and I have some desires to, and I have to make a calculation between that. And sure, and maybe, and that's why I'm for making more meat substitutes. I'm for making not subsidizing the meat and cheese industry, so that their actual value right now, because meat is artificially cheap, my the cost of meat for me is much lower, so it affects my calculations.
I mean, of course, you
Um,
could just eat beans and they're cheaper again.
sure, yeah, that's fair, and I do also eat beans, and so, but the point is that my utility for humans is higher, plus the power thing. Like I can't attack a human, but they'll attack back. That's also part of the calculation. But so in that sense, I am equal to humans, and my value for humans is positive. I want the best for people. While my value for animals, while I like them, like I would prefer animals not suffer, all things being equal, my value for them, and it's also not just like it's not just animals in general. It's cows, pigs, and chicken. For example, my value for dogs and cats, and this is socially constructed totally,
Mhm.
is of pets, right? Like, and in another world, in another universe where those were flipped, where dogs and cats were the meat and pigs and chickens, this would change. My values would change.
I know.
Um, so it's socially constructed, um, absolutely. But so I take a position where I can acknowledge the suffering, acknowledge that they suffer. Maybe they suffer slightly less, and that would be nice in my like for empathy's sakes. I'll be like, oh yay, great, they suffer less suffering, and that makes me happy. But I would feel intellectually dishonest if I took the position that they don't have any consciousness, they don't feel any pain. They're like amoebas, right? I'll be like,
Yeah,
no, they're probably not. They probably do suffer, and I have to live with that. I have to put that in my decision, part of my decision making when I decide to eat chicken or whatever.
right. Yeah, I mean, excuse me. One sec. Yeah, I mean, I agree in the sense that yeah, the animals do suffer, but I think that you're entirely wrong thinking that you can achieve happiness whilst ignoring the suffering of another being. That you know to suffer, and yet, you see, I think the reason that the mistake you would make, I would argue, is that you see an egoism based on an individual level, when I would see egoism as an institutional endeavor
Isn't
that
that
we
almost paradoxical? Like
no.
egoist is very individualistic in
You
a sense.
see, no, because if you look at all of what your ego is, it's not something that just popped out of you, is it? It's something that was constructed. It's something
Yeah,
that it's fundamentally in
but
relation to the Wittgensteinian I.
it acts in me, right? So even if it was constructed by something more global than me, that would be like a argument by biology. It's like because we were evolved to be part of society, like it lives within me, right? Some the my happiness, my ego. So
Oh,
even if it was
I
constructed,
agree that it's in you. Like that's no doubt. That's not something I'm disagreeing with. But that the expression of that subjectivity cannot be done on an individual level. It requires other individuals to tell you how to express it. Like, for example, Hegel makes the point that people think that laws are like restrict our freedom because they limit our desires. So, like you shouldn't kill. Well, that seems like a restriction. Hegel's like, no, that is a freedom. That is freedom itself, because acknowledging that you shouldn't kill, understanding why you shouldn't kill, allows you to differentiate your desires, and this is what he calls second order desires. Well, that's more of a modern term, really. But this is our second order desires. You take into account the system of drives as a whole, work out which desires we should propagate, and then act accordingly. That's freedom. To act on your urges, which are bodily, would not be freedom. But what I would make the point is that these epistemic foundations for how we achieve that somewhat individualistic expression of happiness, that feeling, that phenomena in which we seek inherently. This is tied into institutions. That's not something that we can get away from. Our understandings are not something that we develop by ourselves. They are linguistic. And I would say that they're internalized to such a degree that our values, for the most part, are internalized. We can have certain desires which relate to our biology, and we can even develop desires based on our environment that aren't necessarily within our interests. For example, you get people who desire, self-mastication and stuff like that, and it doesn't bring them happiness, and you have people who end up really depressed and stuff like that because of their desires and stuff like that. So I think that like the difference is understanding which desire we should act upon. It's not that saying we will have an unlimited plethora of desires that we can just pop out of nowhere, but rather out of all the desires we can have, which is the limits of our rational conceptualization of the world, which desires should we choose? Like, which way should we act?
So
And
it's a
that's
meta
institution.
desire sense, right? It's like,
Yeah,
okay, we you can just say we act upon a desire and then we do, but you can also say, okay, which desire is better in a more like meta sense. But I still have the problem where I can't say, I don't know, maybe you can explain this, how you take two different desires and you say one is better without it being totally arbitrary.
because
Because
you
if
would say
somebody,
that it's not better in the sense that it's it feels better, but that overall within the context of your life, in this narrative, which one will help me achieve the greatest instances of the best pleasure pain scenario within this life.
okay, I see your point. So like, if for some reason you desired to bang your head against a rock every day,
Mhm.
uh, and this was just your desire, somebody can say maybe you shouldn't desire to do that because you can gain a greater capacity for happiness if you chose a different, or if you had a different desire
Yeah,
to
and
for example.
sorry.
Oh no, yeah. So yeah, if you, for example, went and gave everybody hugs and I don't know, or be kinder to people, or spend your time learning an instrument or something, you would have a higher capacity for happiness in with that desire. So you should switch to that desire. In that way, you can control your own desires. And I would probably agree with this to an extent where in a way you can change your desires. You can like a lot of your desires are cultural, um and you can influence them. I just don't know how. So if you could for some reason change my desire such that I am vegan or something like that, or that I have more desire for the overall well-being of all animals, uh, it would, I don't know how you would even structure an argument to say this desire has more of a capacity for happiness than this desire. Like, how can you say that your desire uh, for the great well-being of all animals, and maybe it's possible, I'm just thinking out loud, how can you say that this desire will achieve more capacity for happiness than this desire?
So I would say that it would be like the rational fundament, like the fundamentals of how you would be thinking about how you would achieve those good instances in your life. So, for example, we know that we need equality, at least in the basic sense, to prevent we're killing each other. Um, but then we need equality in other ways too, so that we don't necessarily. Um, I guess this is the point I have to make here, really more than anything, is that the I, in the sense of like who we are and what we are, doesn't originate from our biology, but originates from what Levinas would call the we, where he says it's the institutions, it's the society itself, and that this
So
is what gives me myself in the first place.
so the institutions give a person themselves.
Yeah, I mean, if do you know anything about Wittgenstein?
I have no idea. First time I heard about it.
Well, Wittgenstein is a thinker, he's a linguistic thinker, argues that The I is an internalized construct from language games. So essentially, like the way in which we understand ourselves, like our and this is a point that actually Hegel makes way before Wittgenstein, actually. But our personality, as it calls it, is in Hegelian terms, is institutional. It's how we understand ourselves. Like we get these epistemic understand, like how we work, problem solve, and these concepts in which we use to come to conclusions. For example, like respect, how to respect, and so on like that. These basic fundamental conceptions are how we start to um, gain self-understanding, and this is our personality. And that's why Hegel says that all there is the self-understanding the self, because although all of ourselves are individual in the sense we're all expressing an understanding of who and what we are, the foundations of how we are doing that is actually separate from the biological mechanisms at play. It's cultural. It's in what institutions. That's why we're all like, even if we didn't exist together in the sense that we all didn't grow up in such a same political, socio-political environment, it's very likely that with the same language, we will come to the same conclusions.
So, so because of the fact that so the I, the way we look at ourselves is based off of the institutions and the cultures. Um,
So, like from that point, what we enter in is a language game where we
mhm.
start developing concepts together. So like we'll be like, well, how do we understand this object and its relation to me? Well, the only way you can do that is by creating a distance from yourself and the object. Otherwise, it's just in your phenomenological sphere, which Levinas calls the totality of your existence. Whatever's around you is the totality. If you had no language, he argues that there would be you would only feel experience, right? There would be no, you wouldn't be able to observe experience as a.
So without language, this kind of reminds me of like 1984 or something, right? Um, where it's like the language itself influences how you experience the world. Um,
Yeah,
there's probably some truth to it. I'm curious. This could probably be to some degree like tested empirically. Like I'm not sure if you
oh,
can conduct a test
100%.
like
This
this.
is this is something that actually does change. Like, for example, there's people who have there's a culture. I can't remember who they are. Like, I'll have to find the study. There's a culture that have a few different um words for green, and they report that when they Learn English and they stop using their language, like their native language, over time, their experience of the color green changes. That's because they would have lost certain concepts. This is the in the
Well,
philosophy of
isn't
mind.
isn't the whole color thing more of a categorization thing, and that like a lot of cultures for them, I think green encompasses both green and blue, and all the colors in between there. So when they categorize, I guess, oh yeah, cultures that categorize colors in different ways are better at distinguishing those colors, I suppose. I think
But this
is
is this is
so.
the whole thing. Like, but what is there except for distinctions, like distinctions, right? I
Mhm.
mean, if I understand this reality as a single object and nothing in between it, then I wouldn't understand how to achieve any goal in relation to goodness. But if I can make, various distinctions, then I gain greater and greater understandings, more speciality, was it this specific understandings of reality. Take, for example, music. If I was to say like, oh, I like, if we just have the concept music, that's one concept. But then, there's different genres of music. And then there's different genres in those understandings of
Mhm.
music. And I might understand that there are certain things within each that these particular like noise structures, we'll call it like, like whatever, like harmonics, whatever, create different um pleasure responses within me. And I can understand that I may associate myself with one type of music over another, or at least like certain types of music I would seek to avoid. For example, some people, like, I mean, if you've ever heard Japanese noise music, you would know that you just avoid Japanese noise music. It is goddamn awful. And,
Do you take a position that there's some types of music that is better than others? It's a bit of a pretentious position, but like the classical music is a higher music than something else. Or do you take that kind of position, or all music is created equal?
I wouldn't necessarily say all music is created equal because
I guess
I
this goes
think
more
the
into
value
aesthetics,
of
which is
music, yeah, I think
aesthetics is a region of philosophy that I have very little experience. It's a little fascinating. I'm interested in getting into it more, but I guess this would go into that sort of route, which I
oh, I mean, like this is why Kant is like an objective aestheticist, isn't he? He understands like beauty is a thing. Like it's not something
Mhm.
that, and it's like Plato. Like beauty is not something that's in the eye of the beholder. It's a thing.
So my implicit reaction to that is it's obviously false, but I haven't really read his arguments for it.
I mean, it's pretty decent arguments in his I think it's the theory of judgment. But the thing is that um, I don't disagree in the sense that it's subjective, in the sense that individuals will prefer certain types of music over others. Um,
I just take
but
the position that
that's
people
not
are generally pretty similar. So if you take a random percent of people and they like a certain thing, they consider a certain thing aesthetically appealing, then you are likely, if you take another random sample of people, that those people would share a similar view. Because humans are very similar.
yeah, I
But I
agree.
wouldn't
But
consider
also
that objective. I would consider that a popular opinion in the same way that if every
universal
single
almost.
person on the planet believed that chocolate tasted better than vanilla, that doesn't make it an objective fact. It just makes it a very, very popular opinion. And it being 100% or 99% doesn't affect the objectivity of it.
Well,
So it would
what it
still be
does, what it takes
subjective.
it is to universal, isn't it? Like it's objectively true that we believe that chocolate is the best, but it is not objectively
That the
true that chocolate is the best.
Yes, we objectively believe. We it's objective that most people like or believe chocolate tastier than vanilla. That would be an objective statement, but the actual statement itself wouldn't be objective. And so,
Yeah,
in that sense, I would I would consider it subjective.
you
Maybe
see,
they define it differently, so I don't know.
um, like I would say, actually, can we take just a 2 minute break? Because otherwise,
Totally,
I am definitely going to weigh myself. So,
that's fine. Yeah,
right, I will be 2 minutes, guys,
am I
and
just going to be here and I can say
you
anything?
can stay here. You can read the chat if you want to reply to anything in the
All
chat.
right, I
If
haven't
anyone would
looked at
like
the
to ask
chat once.
Endless Aporia any questions while I'm gone, please do. I will be right back, and you enjoy the sight of my dog.
Oh, all right, let's look at the chat. With agriculture, you are ruining the earth. What value do you get from that? That is in conflict with your utility. I agree. I think that that harming the environment is in conflict with my utility. The question is, which I think is a genuine question, is considering two states of the world. One where uh, all meat or the meat industry stops, and we get the ecological benefits from that, meaning less, you know, cow methane production and deforestation and stuff like that. And the state of the world, but in that state, I can also not eat meat. Versus a state where I do get the ecological consequences, and but I don't get to eat meat anymore. So I have to decide, and I think it's very hard to know because I haven't experienced one of those worlds, which one would be better. So you'd have to make a argument that that I have no experience with, essentially. I'm from which Discord? I am Aporia in Discord, but I don't know which Discord you are referring to.
I am back. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just responding to, I don't
Yeah.
know, some comments.
Um, yeah, just to quickly as well respond to what you said there. Bring it back. Kind of lost my train of thought. What was the last thing you said again? It was
Just
that sorry,
just now or before you left?
before I left.
Um, there's something about aesthetics, probably, right?
Oh yes, it was aesthetics. Yeah, I guess the point I would make is that it would be the same as Ayn Rand. It would be that like the moral really comes into the point in which we go, why do we have the desire? Right? It's like, is it a whim? Like, do I just like liking rock music or whatever music you like? That's that it is true you have that desire, and it would be true that if everyone had that desire, that it would be, their desire. But whether it is good for them to like rock music, whether it is actually what brings them the greatest enjoyment, is something they need to work out. And how they would work it out is through moral conceptual growth, or in which they
But
would say like they that's when the aesthetic becomes the moral, because you start working out whether it in fact brings me the enjoyment I think it does.
there's some research into the music question specifically, which was uh, people found out, or researchers found out, that the music that you listen to at around like 13 and 14 tends to be the music that you will find that you will enjoy for the rest of your life. It correlates very highly with the music you listen to in 13, 14. So if you enjoyed, like, if your dad was playing like indie rock and when you were in 13, 14, you will tend to like indie rock in the future. It's very cultural in that sense.
Well,
So if
weirdly
you,
enough, I mean, like the thing, 12 and 13 is the birth in which we become, like psychologists argue, in which we become like autonomous, isn't it? Like like
mm,
morality becomes more autonomous, in which where rationality starts to kick in. So it could be that
mhm.
our categorizations are built around that time, and that's something that we internalize as a
Yeah.
as a
So I guess a good like, I don't know. I'm just rambling for the most part, but if somebody introduced their children at 13 to 14 to some very, very niche music that is very hard to come by, they might have a less of a capacity for happiness because they will lack this music that they really enjoy, while somebody who plays like pop music that is everywhere at 13 and 14, they have more of a capacity because it's more available to them. I don't know. Is that dumb or?
no, I think that's a pretty good point. But then it shows that the aesthetic can breach the moral then, in which
So would play like listening to popular music at that age be the morally correct decision if it
well,
grants
it
more capacity
depends.
for happiness?
Well, if it granted, it's not just about the capacity for happiness, it's about the kind of like this is the I mean, if you I really love Mill when he talks about higher and lower pleasures. So
Hmm.
I would say that the it's not just about what we enjoy, it's about what will genuinely bring us like a good experience. So like for
Hmm.
example, if you get an appreciation for something like I don't know, like more complex forms of music,
Hmm.
and that maybe classical or I don't know, like I don't really care, but whatever it is, or even just something that helps you study, right? Like study music or whatever, and that ultimately leads you to studying more, and then you once studying more, you gain skills, and those skills increase your happiness. That might be greater than the pleasure that you would have achieved by just listening to pop music and having a dull, like kind of shallow existence, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's definitely a area of philosophy that I should look into more because it's quite interesting. And I just have these like very initial, very like, you know, first freshman in college kind of view on it. So maybe there's some deeper
No, that's what philosophy is
ideas.
about. That's what philosophy
Yeah.
is about. Like philosophy is about like seeing reality and trying to understand it. Like that's how that's how I think philosophy really like it's that's what we endeavor to do. It's a
Hmm.
pursuit of truth, and truth exists like all around us. It's not something that's like in one thing or another, and that's why philosophy is literally everything. I mean, that's why at the end of all disciplines, you get a PhD, you get like a doctor of philosophy, because you will be starting to breach the theoretical at this point. Like that's that you get to the end and then you start thinking like, okay, what is my subject? Why do I do it? What am I trying to achieve? And then it's also like the deeper questions within it, like, what is it to do X? And this is like why it becomes philosophical. But not only that, I mean, in philosophy, we have such a variety of different disciplines. Like, I mean, between I mean, epistemics, ethics, metaphysics, like ontology,
Epistemology.
like philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, like language.
Hmm.
There's so much. It's like every area of human experience has a
Hmm.
philosophical ramification, like because that's what philosophy is
Yeah,
studying.
there is a thing I don't like about philosophy, which is a bit also what makes philosophy, which is a bit of a lack of empiricism, where sometimes you see people just making certain proclamations. Um,
Depends
and
on what branch. Some branches of philosophy you'd probably love because they'd be really empirical. Like, I mean, like British empiricism, like it led to analytic philosophy, for example, and analytic philosophy, depending upon what it's talking about, can be really empirical. Especially things like
Mhm.
typically philosophy, which gauges like understandings of like neuroscience and stuff like that,
Yeah,
and like
but then
how
I think you start bordering into science when you start going very empirical, right? Because you
what is science, but if it's not a philosophy, do you know what I mean? It's
Well,
just a different
it
branch of
is, but science has the ability to falsify ideas. It has the ability to repeat studies, and has like error correcting mechanism. Where oftentimes in philosophy, you have like this is what it means to be moral, and then like or the Plato's function argument or something like that, where the human's function is to be rational, and I'm like, okay, but how do you know that or whatever?
See, like
Um,
I can't help but just take the absolute opposite approach. I think that science makes far more assumptions than philosophy. Basically, it assumes the scientific method is correct in the first place, and that we can falsify and so on. But
But the thing
rather,
is,
like
for
the
me, in defense of science, it has very strong predictive power. So it has utility. So even if science doesn't like isn't correct, it has utility for us in that it betters our ability to make predictions.
the only way that would know that it had predictive power is to philosophically justify it in the first place.
Um, so,
Like,
but
how
like
do we
you
know
can
that it's achieving like a better conception of truth? I mean that's
that's the
essentially,
predictive power, right? Because
but that's where you
if
get
you
into
can
the philosophy of
predict.
science.
Yeah, that is what you get in the philosophy of science, which is like what is evidence, what is the meaning of evidence, and then for me it's all about like predictive power, because if you don't get predictive power, then you're it's of no use to me. Like that's the utility
I,
of
I,
science.
I completely agree, but I think that's the beauty of philosophy in the first place because it's to narrow down our focus. Like it's to apply reason to the point in which we
Can.
really, really understand as much as possible in
Hmm.
order to make predictions and conceptual growth. And this
Yeah.
is the thing, I would say that the concepts that science uses are the same linguistic concepts, like they're developed in a language game, and that this is a rational categorization, this is a rational development. And that's what
Hmm.
philosophy is. The only difference between philosophy and science in real regard in one sense, sorry, is that philosophy will rely on rational, logical endeavors, and science will rely on empirical. But the point is that like philosophy, science has got to rely on reason as well. Like it can't not. If it
Yeah.
did, then it wouldn't actually it wouldn't be able to produce a deductive argument to come to a conception of truth.
But rationality itself or logic itself doesn't get you anything. You need certain premises because you need certain axioms, and assuming those axioms and logic, you can get certain conclusions. Without any premises, uh, you're just doing math.
But I agree. But these premises are linguistic constructs. These are rational categorizations in the first place. Like it's that metaphysical in which they've been divested from the world. So when we go back to that language thing that we talked about before, and like how do we get objects? These objects are a linguistic construction in which we appropriate. We can't do this individually because we can't create a language of one because we wouldn't be able to prove that our private language actually associated one object as different to another. There would be no fundamental basis for calling something A, B, C, D because we would be trapped in what Levinas calls the totality of our experience. We would be just experiencing one single flow.
I don't necessarily agree. I think that even if we don't have, sure, like language does change the way you view the world, you interact with the world. But I don't know how you can, first of all, determine or how you can see like that it's the total, like without language, that it would be, we would have, I think language, the utility of language comes in your ability to communicate ideas and communicate with yourself and sort of in that sense. So language you can use to have a shared understanding of the world and work together. And in that sense, that's where language comes from. But if you were the only person on this planet and you just existed, and somehow you managed to survive, and there was no language, no means of communicating, or nobody to communicate with, I still think you would be able to distinguish, food from not, or you would still be able to live. Animals still like this. Would
Well,
you
yeah,
still
I
have
mean, but
higher cognitive functions, like high rationality?
I don't think there would. What do you think?
You don't think that a person with no language could have this like higher higher
They could
level of
have
thinking?
they could in some respects they could make inductive arguments, but the predictive power of inductive arguments is negligible. That's why science
They
doesn't
would they would
use.
still know that the sun rises the
Well, they
next
wouldn't
day.
know anything. They would. This is the thing. They would think. They would think the sun would rise the next day, but they would have no justification for saying that the sun would rise the next day.
Well, they would have this, and people have this pattern recognition that's, I think, built into our nature. We see patterns everywhere. We see that the sun rises today, it rises again, and it'll rise another time.
I guess
So
the more than anything, it would be the fact that one, like, okay, they would understand, like, for example, they might be able to pattern associate the objects, the visual objects around them, as having occurred certain patterns, but they certainly wouldn't be able to create, like, for example, the concept of a sun. It would be like that big glowy orange ball in the sky, that sensual object of my
yeah,
experience.
that
Of my,
is what the sun is for them with all the information they have.
yeah, yeah, that's the thing. It's what it's for them, but it's not for us. We have a much greater inferences that are built upon this
No, but
concept of the sun.
if take two different considerations, one where you have a person who does have a language, for some reason somebody uh, that has the language doesn't have any of the scientific knowledge of what the sun is. They just have a label for whatever this thing is that goes like that. And a person who doesn't have a label, doesn't have the speech or the structure for it. Maybe for me, the label is only as good as its ability to communicate with other people. So if another person says that, he could say, "Look, sun," and we both agree that the sun refers to that object, then we can now communicate about that object. But if you
But
were
that's the thing. But what does this communication get with?
the communication, wait, what does that communication get you?
Yeah, like, what do we get from it? Like, I would say that we get a greater deductive epistemic
Absolutely.
justification. Like, so, for example,
Oh,
I could say that based upon even Newtonian physics, like, I know that the way that physical bodies um are structured and the way that the universe works, that the sun will rise tomorrow. It's greater epistemic justification for my premise that the sun will rise tomorrow. I mean, that's kind of the point. Like, otherwise, it's how I want to say how true the premise is, but how certain you can be of it. Like, there's a greater possibility that I am correct within my within my premise that it is going to rise tomorrow
uh,
based upon language, and that's deductive reasoning. inductive reasoning, I would be shooting in the dark a lot of the time, and I'll be drawing inferences from my experience, which can be inherently biased.
Yeah, so people I think do have this implicit idea of induction, and just we assume that induction works. There is a rationality for induction, if you know, like the rationality would be that you it's sort of tied with the randomness and the idea that if like if this was randomly selected from all the possible states, um, and this kept on happening, then the probability that it would happen again because it's another just random event would also be high. So if you saw 10 red houses in a row, right, is the next house going to be also red? Well, if you assume that the 10 you saw were was part of the random houses that exist, and all of them were 10, for all intents and purposes, the likelihood for another one to be red is high. Now, if you assume some sort of like this is designed in a way, like there's more of a possible, maybe it's not random, then the possibility of it not being red increases or something like that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if anything, that shows why we should use deduction over induction. So it shows that if everything was random, induction would be as accurate as deduction, because indeterminacy would mean that deduction would be incapable of providing a pattern recognition system which would provide a greater certainty for our knowledge. However, if everything isn't random, then deduction would provide a greater certainty in a pattern recognition system to determine whether this conclusion was right. And so I'm better off using deduction, because even if everything was absolutely indeterminate, I would have the greater likelihood to achieve my ends. Uh, I would have at least the same to a greater likelihood to achieve my ends. Pragmatically, I should use deduction.
Yeah, I I think in this realm we sort of agree. I think we sort of treaded a bit from the topic.
Yeah, I mean this is like epistemics and like philosophy side.
We're talking about induction now. Like I think the best way to connect would be uh, so we kind of went from capacity for happiness to language, and then to this conversation. I still am not quite sure how the language, and even if we acknowledge
It's
that
really
language,
relevant what we're talking about, though, I think.
yeah. So even if we acknowledge that language changes our understanding and our perception of the world and how we interact with the world, I still don't know how you can determine that certain desires, like the desire uh, to live in a more global, like more, like why would you have three people? One person who's purely like individualistic, one person who has empathy for people, and one person who has empathy for all animals. How do you determine which of these three people has the best desire, the most capacity, the happiness, the least contradiction, or whatever?
Well, the same way that would determine the epistemic the epistemic validity of all claims, it would be through verification. We would have to verify. So this is the beautiful thing about it. The more subjectivity that's expressed, the more people will agree that this is good.
If there was, okay, so if um but the thing is not necessarily true. It's they might, because it's I think impossible to compare people's happiness. There's no way of doing that. If you experience um if you experience if you like, maybe, okay, maybe if somebody went from not eating meat, or from eating meat to not, they now, okay, they can say they feel better now, right? They feel more happiness than they ever did eating meat, and then that can convince somebody that say, okay, I would have more of a capacity for happiness if I didn't eat meat. And in that sense, yes, that could work. You'd have to find it convincing, and then
Well,
switch.
it's like how do you achieve happiness would be based upon a decision-making process, which is based upon categorizations. Each categorization is based upon a different thing. So it's like I entered a language game because I desire, and I desire to achieve uh, the greatest possible desire, the greatest possible fulfillment of my desires, right? The greatest good, essentially
Hmm.
for me, right? By definition, I can't help but desire the most desirable thing. Cool. Now, how do I achieve the most desirable thing? Okay, well, I need predictive power to achieve the most desirable thing. So we enter a language game to enter deduction so that I can achieve the most desirable thing. When I enter the deductive process, I would argue that I've internalized like myself in this objective world, which allows me to understand objects as separate, different and build inferences from them, which allows me to achieve the most desirable thing. Um, Now I'm in this scenario. How do I do that? How do I achieve these most desirable things? So I've created these concepts, but I haven't done it by myself. I've created it with other individuals. So we've created these concepts. Now, what ethics is based upon is desire itself. That is the categorization that we use to achieve uh, what is like right and wrong. This like the abstract right, as Hegel calls it. So the abstract right is based upon what is desirable. And we would judge what is desirable based upon the individuals in regards to the judgment. So you'd say like, what is desirable? Me, you, him, them. We're all in this. What is desirable? Or well, what is desirable is if we were to say from an individualist stance, we'd say what is desirable is like I desire murder. Like that is what's most desirable. I want to kill you all. And you'd be like, well, no, that's not what's most desirable because what's most desirable is my life, and that makes no sense. That's a contradiction. So because they're um, because they're not individually created, it would force a contradiction for you to say that was most desirable because that is a
How?
it's a hypothetical it's a hypothetical norm and not a categorical norm. So the predictive power would be limited. You would be inducing that this is most desirable. You wouldn't be actually um you wouldn't have any sufficient reason to say that this is most desirable. So that's when you start entering this point where you start going, okay, what is most desirable is the maximization of desire in a given scenario.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So, but in that case where somebody desires, they have the desire to bang their head against a rock, and then somebody can tell them you would have more of a capacity for desire, like you would have more of a capacity for happiness if you did anything else, really. Your quality of life would be, if you desired something else, you would enjoy it more. Is should like should and to what extent can the person who desires to bang their head against a rock change their desire? Because I don't think that you can I think you can change desires slightly. I don't think you can change
I,
them a lot.
I would agree. I think you can only go so far as your reason will allow your conceptual development. And I think if you can go as far as reason will take you um on like how you can behave, if you don't know how to behave, if like your how ends, excuse me, if your how ends, so like it would be more moral to not eat animals, for example, but there's no way I can do it, then all it implies can. You don't know how to do it. You can't do it,
Yeah,
so
but
you
I
can't
wouldn't
be
call that
obligated to do it.
I wouldn't call that more moral. I would say so for the banging your head against a rock. If I was the person who enjoyed banging my head against a rock, I would be like bummer that I like this was my desire. I'll still do it, but like, man, do I wish that I enjoyed something else more. But this is the thing I enjoy most. But I wish I enjoyed something else
You
more.
see, are you saying that you would enjoy it most? Because there's a good chance that you're not, because the whole point is that it will lead to greater amount of suffering. It's what you enjoy most in the moment, but not what you enjoy most.
No,
And that's what's
right
but
now, it's what I
right,
enjoy
but
most.
right now you have reason, which gives you second order desires, which can supersede those first order desires, where you can go,
We're doing
even
desire
though
calculus now.
this is what, sorry?
We're doing desire calculus now.
Well, that's it. Like it's what's the word? It's delayed gratification.
No, but I don't. I think the delayed gratification is still part of the original desire. Like that's still like I'm still
Oh yeah,
taking.
you're totally bound by your first order desires. I completely agree. But one of the arguments I would make as well is that I mean, are open to so many desires. I mean, the whole point of like, I mean, if all you have to do is look at like the different expressions of desires cross-culturally, then you'd see that well, humans are pretty much a blank slate compared to what we think they are. Like we don't like okay, we all need to eat, we all need to drink, we all need to, we all desire sex in one way or the other, most likely. But even things like that, like people can become psychologically revolted by their base desires to the point in which they don't actually desire them anymore. Um, Humans are incredibly varied in what we can desire. So, I mean, it's very, very unlikely that an individual would have the pathology where they must um, smash their head against the rock. But if they did, we would probably refer them to psychological treatment to try and mm,
Change the desire.
discipline their desires. And that's why Foucault talks about madness and civilization. And he says, well, actually, what madness usually is considered isn't something that is crazy. It's
But
something
there's
which
a
is
sort of
abnormal. And that's
assumption,
where, sorry.
there's a sort of assumption that your desire to, like your desire is has more of a capacity for happiness than the person who's banging their head against a rock. You
Well,
don't really
it's not an
know.
assumption if you can give sufficient reason. I could be like, well, no, you think this is going to bring you happiness, but you keep smashing your head against the rock. You've got
It does.
swelling on your brain.
They wouldn't do it if it didn't bring them happiness.
They
It does,
would, they would. Like if they humans do many things that will
but
bring
then
them more suffering than
it's
happiness.
no longer their desire. Like what I'm referring to is this: if you take a computer and you program it to want to do X, like it does, it picks up a rock and puts it down over and over and over again, and you make it that what it wants to do. So you give it some sort of like this is your programming. This is what you want to do. It'll keep doing this. You can convince it, like you can do anything to it. You'd have to reprogram it to have to want to do something else. And this want is kind of a hard term to do with like
It's
robots.
want to want.
Yeah, so you'd have so then you okay, for some reason this robot has some sort of can understand you when you say, okay, if you were programmed to want to fly a kite, you would be happier. But how like I you how do
But
you make that argument?
like
Like
look at it like this, right? So like this individual who's smashing their head against the rock, right?
yeah,
Like you said you hit the nail on the head when you said that it would no longer be their desire to hit their head against the rock. If
yeah.
they come to realize the reason, the rationality behind it, their second order desire would replace their first order desire. That's what Hegel's getting at. He's not trying to say that you wouldn't be doing that which is most
You think
desirable.
you can
It would be
go
that you would understand desire in such a way that smashing your head against the rock would no longer be your desire, at least immediately, and that you could act differently. Now, what we find is that if we do not make the rational inferences to apply what second order desires immediately to us, we can give in to what urges and what immediate urges, but we can have urges to do the right thing. We can have the urges to do, even if it conflicts what immediate desires. People will, dart in front of traffic to save someone, because their rational decision making process has even led them to that. People will even you'll go to do something that's selfish, and then you'll turn around and you're like,
so
and
I don't know
it
if you convince somebody using rationality that their first or desire is problematic because that would be part of like I would consider that part of their desire, like their long term you call it interests, right? Like
Mhm.
for me, I'm taking this into account in the sense that the person who is banging their head against a rock, I assume that their interest is to bang their head against a rock. So for me to change their desires, I would have to physically change their brain.
Okay, but
Like
if you were to assume that interest was to bang the head against the rock, that will genuinely bring them the greatest amount of enjoyment, then you'd have to provide sufficient reason as to why it would bring them a greatest amount of enjoyment, why their brain is why their nature is in such a way that they would do something which would ultimately end in their demise, for example. Um, And I think that's an argument that can be given, that the nature can be that way inclined. However, I think that if a nature was to differ so greatly, for example, from the overall understanding of how we should live the lives, like the good life for man, then we would be talking nonsense to each other. And I don't think that there's any evidence to say that we are, because I think that overall, like, we can make rational predictions based upon the good life for each other. Um, but that even what I'll be saying is that this individual who is forced into a language game to use the concepts in which we have, if none of them fit his life, um, then what he would find is that he would be in the exact same position as if he was just inducing his happiness anyway. He'd be just accidentally able to stumble upon happiness. He would have no predictive capabilities. But at least this way, he has the opportunity to try.
Okay. So we I think we're about, I don't know if our disagreement is maybe purely a semantic one. I'm not entirely sure. But now I'm more curious. Okay, if we accept all this, we can change our desires using rationality. How would you make the case that, for example, that the vegan argument is a preferred desire, like desiring to be vegan is better than desiring to eat meat?
Okay, so yeah, I would say that like it's based upon desire. Like that's the categorization, and that we need to maximize in every given judgment. And that is how we gain our predictive power in the first place. That what we maximize is this fundamental concept of desire. Um,
So
uh,
so maximizing the entire concept of desire, maximizing
Yeah, because like the concept within, I mean, this concept is a thick concept within our culture and our language. We don't understand, like, for example, we don't understand that which is good based upon just good, and we try and work it out because we end up in like Moore's open-ended question where we're all talking about different things. I'm like, no, this is good, that's good, blah blah blah. Well, what we do is we talk about thick concepts, and we talk about like expressions of goodness and how people react to such things, and objects within their lives. And one of those objects is equality. And equality is related, like we understand why we would seek equality, because equality allows for the expression of our subjectivity. And the fundamental basis for equality is desiring in the first place. It's the fact that we have interests and preferences that we seek to fulfill. And based upon those reasons, animals share exactly the same qualities, which is why the argument from marginal cases seems to have some worth. And this is why Peter Singer is an objectivist and not a subjectivist. Because if he was a subjectivist, then we would be like, name the trait. It can be anything on this wheel. Haha. And the point is that if you do that, then all of the all of the reasons for why we should consider animals is gone. There can only be one reason, and that is the categorization in which we use to deduce what is good for us in the first place. And
Yeah, but
that
why can't I
that
take
has to be desire.
I'm for equality of people, like just
Okay, so
people?
let's say you're for equality of people. You've made a hypothetical, not a categoriz. You made a hypothetical categorization, and not a hypothetical good, and not a categorical good. So then your predictive power is being limited. If you are for the equality of
What can
people,
I not predict that I could if I believed in a further equality?
well, I would say that what you are predicting, if what you are, well, it's just essentially the categorization in the first place. It's like why it would be like, for example, if I asked you what is it about this hypothetical that justifies it in the first place, and you make my own desire. Okay, and you say that my own desire, if it's purely your own desire, well then it's induced and it's untrue. If it's a rational categorization on desire, then it's an
It's
object of an experience. It's metaphysical,
and
independent of any given individual. Because
wait, what?
if it's
I was like, go on. Yeah.
so it has to be independent of any given individual. If you were to say that it's um inherent of a few individuals, namely us, then that like tribal morality, like I only care about British people, for example. Well, then we have induced it. We haven't deduced it. We've induced it. We've just said like, oh, this is what it is. But instead, what we try to seek is to, well, um, what is the foundation for our belief in the first place? And if we hit bedrock at like a sufficient at the sufficient categorization, which would be like, um, I'm trying to explain this in the best way, that given all possible scenarios, our predictive power would be maximized with this understanding of the world in relation to how we make judgments.
I'm still, and I apologize. Maybe it's just me. I still don't understand how prediction is any part of this. Like, what are we predicting? And so,
Well, like it's this is the thing. It'd be like it's abstract, right? It has to be something. This is like sometimes Hegel calls it the science of right. I actually have to go in about like 5-10 minutes. Just let you give you
that's
some.
totally
Um, it it's sometimes called the science of right. It's a conceptual development, and this concept becomes not necessarily broader and broader, but more accurate at what we are trying to describe. And these more accurate, these greater accuracies are generalizations. Like this is the idea of like a straight line is the straightest line that you've ever seen.
think generalizations make the more you generalize, the less accurate, the less
Now,
predictive
it
power you
depends
have.
what you mean by generalized. Because, for example, the laws of logic are generalizations, aren't they? But when we apply them, like the law of identity, that is like the basis. Like the law of non-contradiction and stuff like that are the basis of predictive capabilities. Um, these generalizations serve to operate in such a way that we are able to discern and understand the world in the most effective way possible. These are like universal laws in the same way that we seek patterns in science for that same regard,
But
so that we can increase our predictability,
first
so we can
learn
see the underlying governing laws of the reality.
isn't the first thing you learn in like a Phil 1 class is that the greater the generalization, the more uh, the more difficult it is to substantiate, or like if you were to say all people are I don't know, like ice cream, whatever. That's harder to justify than some people, or like this individual likes ice cream. Like,
Yes, I would agree, but that's the point of like reason, rationality. By definition, for example, all people desire. And by definition, ethics is based upon desiring. We seek good, and good is the most desirable. What is good is in relation to the most desirable, and the most desirable is in relation to that which can feel good. And so that's how we build our inferences in that
it's,
point.
so it's ethics would be a sort of based off of well-being, right? Where it's like, or desire, more specific, not well-being, desire.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, that's fine, but if you start saying that to be ethical you have to care about just desire in general, I would be like, okay, I don't care about desire in general, I care about my desire specifically.
You see,
uh,
but I would say that caring about your desire specifically is what forces you to care about desire in general, because you seek predictive capabilities in regards to your judgments within your life. And
so
those judgments within your life.
okay, this is starting to remind me a little bit of Kant, because right, because in his
It's like you can read Hegel into Kant, actually. There's an argument for that. And it
I,
should remind you a little bit of
my
Kant.
homework is to read Hegel. If we ever decide to talk again, I enjoy this. I know you have to go, but I don't know. It's a good chat.
Yeah.
I should probably read Hegel because I haven't.
Oh dear
Uh,
God, I don't want to suggest it. It's awful.
yeah,
I mean, I do, because he's amazing, and I
yeah.
love the man. But oh God, he writes awfully.
Is there a like a good ex- like summary of his ideas that is more bearable to read? Do you know?
Uh, oh yeah, God. I mean, like a good summary, like not by him, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, Peter Singer. on Hegel.
Okay, Peter's.
It's like sometimes it's called a short introduction to Hegel. It's 100 pages long. Brilliant.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. Uh,
It's if I was to sum it up in one sentence, I would say there is only the self understanding the self,
okay,
because he's an absolute idealist. So
interesting. So okay, so but to go back to the actual point, I don't know, you have 5 minutes or so before you have to
yeah,
go. Okay, um, so my selfish desire is to increase overall, like is is for the benefit of all desire. Um,
like Kant would say, the rational desire of all individuals is happiness, and your happiness lies in your predictive capabilities. And this is why I would say that the Greeks understood virtue and happiness to be one object, mainly eudaimonia.
because when I think of predictive capabilities, is I when I make a prediction, I say this is how I expect people to behave, and then if it does, and the more specific I was, that means that something internally was there's something true in what I said. Maybe not all of it is true, but some nugget of it is true if I have consistent predictive power. Um, but I still like I'm sort of I should probably just think about it more. But like I'm still baffled by the predictive predictions in the sense of like I can make predictions about people. I assume people desire certain things, or I assume people desire in the same way I do, to some extent. They have because I know that people are similar. I sort of can uh, assume how people will think and how they will desire, but uh, and then I can make predictions based off of that. But I don't need to care about the desire that they have. I can assume, like, if I was in their position, that how would I behave? What would my desires be? But I don't need to accept that those desires are those of my own.
It's almost like what he's trying to say is that based on game theory, you could manipulate the game to fulfill your desire over another. I think Alistair McIntyre gives a really good argument against this, where he says, like, for example, I could teach a child to appreciate chess by giving them a bar of chocolate. And every time they played the game, it would be to win the chocolate. Now, in that scenario, the child has every motivation to cheat because the greater likelihood that they win, the greater the likelihood of they
They won't
enjoying the
joy
chocolate.
of the game. Like they wouldn't actually accept the joy of the game. They would just want the
Yeah,
consequences of the game.
exactly. And
Uh,
and this is his point. Like you would lose the game itself.
so
It
to take this analogy to my position, which would be that I know that they desire these things, but by not accepting their desires sort of as my own, I am not getting the benefit of the enjoyment of their desires. Like I get some of their enjoyment of the desires by accepting some of their desires as my own.
Yeah, and more than that, I would say that like it's an understanding of self that you and them are actually part of the we, and that is you. Like that.
So in a sense, I agree with this, at least to some extent, because I think when I care about people, when I'm nice to people, I get some of when they're happy, it makes me happy. I have that empathy for them. Uh, the thing
I
is,
would say this is a byproduct though. Like the beautiful thing about it is that it's the maximization of your predictive capabilities in the first place.
yeah, the thing is, I would challenge how far this extends because I think the further you go into the tree of life, the less their desire like boy did that rat feel good today and that makes me happy that that rat accomplished its goals. That's true to some extent. If a rat succeeds, I'll and I imbue it with some sort of uh
Altruistic joy.
altruistic joy, yeah, then it might make me slightly more happy. But if you extend this further and further and further, at some point I'm like, I have no, like, I don't really care if the ant succeeds its goal. It's kind of pissing me off. Get off my like table. I don't eat my food. Don't whatever, right?
But
uh
then I think you've got to appreciate that you are part of it as well, and that For example, you can have an appreciation for your own, like the ant is acting in its own self-interest when it is seeking the food. And you, by getting the ant off your food, are acting in your self-interest. And you have an obligation to yourself. This is why, like someone like W.D. Ross, he points out, he's like, if you have two scenarios, you can help someone, namely your mother, or you can help someone who's not your mother. Both will bring exactly the same utility. Who should you help? Well, you would help your mother. And he'd say that you should help your mother because overall, it will bring more utility to help your mother because you've created an institutional environment which maximizes the greatest outcome in the first place.
Person who's like, what if I know that that mother, the other mother's son, is right there next to me, like,
Well,
or
this is the thing. It's about understanding your obligations as an individual, and this is the real goal of ethics. That's to understand what our obligations are. And these are institutional, these are given to us. I have an obligation as a son more than I have an obligation as a British individual or a global individual and so on like that, because
you use
the family, I mean, it doesn't have to be this way. Like they can have other institutional formats, but in our current format, this is how it works. And if it didn't work like that and I act otherwise, then I would risk the greatest expression of utility.
yeah, but we use the word obligation. How do you use that word? Because I don't
I would
think
say that
obligation to anything. Like
I
I,
would say that you have an obligation in the sense that it isn't that it's something that you cannot help but want in the first place. So it's like um it would be like the order of X. So the good watch is the watch that tells the time,
mhm.
right? A good watch ought to tell the time. A watch ought to tell the time. It's a
You
functional
said
concept.
that's
And this
sort
is
of
this is
for me, the function argument, the problem with the function argument is that a good watch is good for something. So for a person, so a watch at its own in the universe
yeah.
doesn't metric of good, but like it's good for people. Like
Mhm.
it, a good watch is good for me if it tells the time. It, by itself, it has no concept of goodness. That's why I don't buy the function argument for people. Like the
Why
function,
not? Because all of your actions are good for you. And this is the thing. Like it's all relating back to this individual conception of good.
I'm talking more of an abstract person, like with me separate, like a person, a person's function in and of itself. I don't think a person has a function. The person's function is only relative to something, for something that functions well in whatever way. It's good for the person.
Well, I would say that this is the only thing, one of the only things that is fundamental to human nature, that we seek happiness. And that is your function. I would say that by definition, you desire, and as a subject, you are inherently desiring, all subjects desire, and that their function is to satisfy their desire in the greatest way possible to achieve that which is most desirable. And as a being that can understand itself temporally, the greatest life is
I could,
better than the greatest,
I
than
don't,
the greatest.
function is to desire happiness. I would just say I desire happiness.
Yeah, but that's like for example, it's like what a watch is something that tells the time. It's that's the function of a watch because that's what a watch is.
Yes,
That
but
the
I don't think you can
and
extend
and
it.
and and well, in a person, I would say that what they are is something that
Uh,
desires good. It's just something that
a
occurs
watch
through
is
time.
created to tell the time. So the function for whoever made it is to tell the time. I think there's no, you can't see any function for people because we evolved not to function for something, but rather are the consequences of an almost deterministic, like things as self-reproducing with slight alterations tend to become more and more complex, like an automaton. Um,
But it's not that we need to seek an overall like objective creator to give us a function. Like the like meaning exists in the sense that it is linguistic and the reason we seek meaning is coming from this inherent process that exists within us. It's not something that needs to be like it needs to be understood outside of ourselves. What we know is that we function in the sense that we are functioning. That's all we need to care about. We don't need to ask why we are functioning. It's irrelevant. It's the point is, what do we all seek? Do we all have one fundamental goal? Yes, happiness.
Yeah,
That's the argument.
I also don't think that I don't think that that's our collective fundamental goal. I think we each have our function is our own happiness. Where basically, I view it this way: objective moral system is you have a function and you
Mhm.
have the state of the world, and you input the state of the world into this function, and out pops a number or something. And so you can have two states of the world into this exact same function, and you can get to two worlds, and one will have a higher value than another. This would be an objective moral system. You have one function, and you have different states of the world, and you can have worlds that are better than others. I view it this way: every single individual has their own function for the state of the world. This function also takes the state of the world, outputs a number, but each person has a different one. And you can, in a sense, collectivize them. You can use John Rawls' thought experiment and say, okay, how do we take all of these separate functions that are all relative? They're not. They don't have any. You can't compare them. A 10 for this one is different from a 5 for this one. You can just randomize them and pick which one you would prefer, and then you have one global function for this system. So in that way, but in the end, every single person has their function, and you can work together with other people, and that function, those can be correlated. So one person's happiness can increase the function, can increase another person's happiness, and then there's some maximization problem, like some sort of game theory maximum problem.
But this is I mean, that only really becomes a problem when we start going to so abstract. Like it's like Hegel's understanding of the abstract right is built upon um judgments made on an individual level, just as Aristotle's understanding of the good life was based upon individual judgments made at an individual then an institutional level. What we create are institutions which house our concepts, and we create deeper and more rich concepts which allow us to understand life in a greater and more complex way. It's like um, it's like with the point with when you say about happiness, like okay, I seek my happiness. I don't seek happiness as a whole. Well, yeah, that's true. Like, that's how you would start. But regardless, even if that's how you start, I'm not sure if that's actually how you start, because I would say that you kind of internalize your I in the first place from this collective
People's
language structure
happiness
in the first place.
affects my happiness. I
But
would say that, but it
oh,
would still be my happiness as the ultimate goal.
yeah, but this is the point. Like, even if your happiness is the ultimate goal, you enter a language game which uses the categorizations, those rational categorizations, to achieve your happiness. So it's like the point is that when you try and achieve happiness, you are going to use these concepts which you cannot induce, because if you do induce, you limit your chances of achieving happiness. Do you see
And
what I
those
mean?
concepts would be stuff like equality and
Yeah.
like values, these virtues that we have. So I would induce equality with my language, or and in that sense, if I induce these values that only exist in a more like society level,
Mhm.
then I am caring more about overall happiness. Um,
But without caring about that happiness, you cannot show appreciation properly for your own happiness, for your own self-gratification, because otherwise you wouldn't know how to act in order to achieve it.
um, I'll have to keep thinking. I assume you have to go. It's
I
been
do. I really have to go.
great talking.
Um,
I'll think about it more. If you want, hit me up. We can chat
yeah, I
again.
would love another chat. I would love another chat. I'll do some more reading, and hopefully I can come back with some more like
100-page Hegel thing. What was the name of
yeah.
that? What
It's
was
that was Peter Singer on a short introduction here.
okay? A short introduction to Hegel. Okay, I'll look into that. Great
think it's
talk.
on. I think it's on Audible as well because I use Audible a lot. I think it's on Audible as well, so I think it's quite useful. Like even self-recognition is an important part of Hegel, and I think that's something that I'm really interested in as well. And you'll probably see what I'm talking about when I've talked about the self in Hegelian philosophy.
Gotcha. All right. Well,
Yeah,
Great talk. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate it. Everyone, I hope you have appreciated Endless Aporia coming on the channel. It's quite difficult to express your ideological stances in like an open format and have a real discussion about it, but I think he's done a really great job. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone who's watched. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And as always, try to gain some perspective.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.